Hi, I've written a new story for you. I really hope you're going to enjoy it. Let's listen.
At my engagement party, my mother-in-law slapped me across the face in front of 27 people, then called me a gold digger. Then my fiancé stood up and announced this. The whole room froze. Our engagement party was in a private dining room on the top floor of a hotel in downtown Chicago, all candlelight, white linen, and the kind of low jazz that made every conversation sound more expensive than it was. There were 27 people at the party, exactly the number Ethan's mother had approved, and I knew that because she had corrected the count twice in front of me. My fiancé Ethan was near the windows with two friends from business school, laughing too hard at something small, while I stood by the champagne tower with his mother, Vivian, and his father, Richard Holloway, both of them dressed like the room belonged to them. Vivian touched the sleeve of my dress and smiled without warmth. "This is very tasteful," she said. "You always do better when you keep things simple." I thanked her because there were people close enough to hear, and because I had already learned that with Vivian, every sentence came with a blade folded inside it. Ethan's father glanced at my ring, then at Ethan, as if he were still checking a purchase order. I kept smiling, shoulders back, glass steady, answering questions about the food and the florist, like none of this was strange. It was her party, and she meant me to remember it. The digs started early and never really stopped. Vivian told one couple that Ethan had always been soft-hearted, then turned to me and added, "That's probably part of your good timing." Later, when Ethan kissed my cheek on his way past, she watched the ring and said, "Some girls spend years trying to land a man with direction. You were very lucky." The words were light. The aim was not. I answered the way I always did with her. "I feel lucky, yes." Ethan heard enough to step in with a quick, "Mom," and a tired smile, the one he used when he wanted a problem to disappear without touching it. Vivian lifted one shoulder and sipped her champagne as if she had merely complimented the weather. Around us, her friends kept up their small nods, letting her set the tone. I could feel the shape of the evening being built around me, not with one insult big enough to point at, but with a dozen small ones that would sound silly if repeated later. Ethan squeezed my hand once when he drifted by and whispered, "Just get through dinner. She's in one of her moods." I looked at him, then at his mother, smiling. She wasn't in a mood. She was making a point. She didn't relax. One of Vivian's friends, a woman named Darlene, who wore diamonds at 4 in the afternoon, asked how Ethan and I had first met. I said we had met when the company I was building still rented half a floor over a printing shop on the west side, and Ethan was pitching routing software to regional carriers. Darlene laughed and said, "Oh, weren't you the one who used to take the Madison bus every morning? Ethan told us that story once." I smiled because it was true. Before my first office had parking, I took the bus, rain or snow, laptop on my knees, coffee balanced like a dare. Vivian turned so fast you would have thought Darlene had handed her a script. "See, that's what I admire," she said loudly enough for the cluster around us to hear. "Ambitious in all the wrong ways." There was a small pause, just long enough for everyone to understand she had not misspoken. "Some people mistake struggle for character," she added. "But upward motion can look very strategic from the outside." A few people glanced at me, then away. Ethan's cousin lowered her eyes to her plate. Darlene immediately busied herself with a napkin. I set my glass down before I said something sharp, because that would have become the story instead. That line landed exactly how she wanted. I told myself to make it to cake. That was the deal I made in the ladies' room mirror after the bus comment, and 2 more remarks about matching lifestyles and family standards. I ran cold water over my wrists, fixed my lipstick, and went back into the room because I loved Ethan, and because I had no interest in letting Vivian say I was dramatic on top of everything else. When I returned, Ethan met me near the gift table, concern finally written across his face. "Are you okay?" he asked under his breath. "I'm fine," I said. "Go talk to your friends. I'm not giving her a scene." He hesitated, then nodded, which irritated me more than if he had argued. Vivian called for pictures before I could say anything else. She arranged people like furniture, moving Ethan's aunt left, a college friend right, Ethan beside her, then looked at me and said, "Lena, closer please. There's no reason to hover." I stepped into frame, Ethan's hand settling at my back. The photographer counted down. Vivian smiled for the camera with the same mouth she used to cut me. I decided, right there, that I would be gracious through dessert, thank the last guest, and leave before this got uglier. I was still trying to save the night. The accusation came between the toasts and the cake, in that loose, standing around moment when people are full enough to stop moving and careless enough to listen. Ethan had gone to the bar with 2 friends. I was near the center table answering a question about the floral arrangements when Vivian tapped her spoon against her glass. It was not a formal toast. It was worse. The room quieted out of habit. She smiled at me first, which should have warned me. "I think commitment is such a beautiful thing," she said, "especially when both people understand exactly what they're committing to." Her eyes stayed on me. Marriage is serious business. Family is serious business, and sometimes, if we're honest, timing tells you more than love does. A few guests shifted. Ethan looked up from across the room. Vivian went on, calm as ice. "A young woman appears just as a family becomes visible, established, comfortable. A ring follows, a date follows. People call it romance. Some of us know what opportunism looks like." No one even pretended not to understand her. I felt every head in that room turn. Ethan took 1 step toward us. Now everyone was listening. I could have walked out then. I think about that sometimes. Instead, I put my glass down and answered her in the same voice I would use to correct an invoice. "Vivian, I have never asked Ethan for money," I said. "Not once." She gave a small laugh through her nose. "That's not the point." "It is, actually," I said. "I pay my own bills. I bought my own dress. I didn't ask for this party. I don't use your family accounts, your cards, your anything. So if you want to say something about me, at least say something true." I heard the scrape of Ethan's shoes behind the crowd, but Vivian stepped half an inch closer, making it impossible for him to slide easily between us. "Truth?" she said. "Truth is rarely popular at celebrations." I could smell her perfume, sharp and floral, underneath the champagne. "You expect me to believe you're here for love alone?" "I don't expect anything from you," I said. "Only basic respect." That should have ended it. In a normal room, with decent people, it would have. But her face changed at the word respect, as if I had taken something from her by asking for it. My calm made her angrier. Vivian's voice dropped, which somehow made everyone lean in harder. "Basic respect," she repeated. "That's rich." Then she looked me up and down in a way that was almost bored. "You came into my son's life at exactly the right moment. You attached yourself quickly. You let people think you were harmless. Don't insult me by pretending this isn't obvious." Ethan was close enough now that I could see his mouth set flat. "Mom, stop," he said. Vivian ignored him. She took another step toward me until there was barely a foot between us. Then, before anyone could move or speak, she lifted her hand and struck me across the face. It was not a wild slap. It was precise. The sound cracked through the room and bounced off glass and silver and the low hotel ceiling. My head turned with it. For 1 second, all I registered was heat. Hot cheek, hot ear, Hot eyes I refused to let spill. Somebody gasped. Somebody set a fork down so carefully it made no sound at all. Ethan said, "What the hell?" But even that felt distant. The room went flat and airless after that. I tasted metal where my teeth had caught the inside of my lip and kept my hand at my side because I would not touch my face like a wounded child in front of Vivian. 27 people stood in silence around the dessert table, around the flowers, around the place where his mother had just hit me like I belonged to her. Ethan's father looked more annoyed than shocked, which told me something I had not wanted confirmed. Vivian herself seemed to realize only after the sound faded how far she had gone. She did not apologize. She straightened the cuff of her jacket and said, clean and clear, the entire room hearing every syllable, "You are a gold digger. Now perhaps we can be honest." My eyes burned, but the tears stayed where they were. Ethan moved then, slow at first, almost too controlled, as if he understood that one wrong motion would either explode the room or clear it completely. He took off his jacket and draped it around my shoulders without asking. Then he pulled a linen napkin from the table and held it out. I didn't take it. His jaw flexed once. The chair behind him scraped against the floor as he turned it aside with his leg and faced the room instead of his mother. Nobody breathed. And that was the moment Ethan faced the room and spoke. People expected Ethan to do one of two things, calm his mother or calm me. I could see it in the way the room leaned toward him, waiting for the usual family script. Vivian seemed to expect the same. She lifted her chin like she was ready to accept a son's embarrassed correction and move us all toward dessert. Ethan did neither. He looked at me first. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly. I nodded once because I needed him to move before my own anger started shaking loose. He touched my shoulder, then turned to the room with the look he wore in business when he was done being lied to. "Then there's something all of you should know," he said. A few guests shifted. Vivian let out a short laugh, like she could still manage this. "Ethan, enough," she said. "Not now." He did not even glance at her. That alone changed the room. Ethan's father set his drink down too hard. Someone near the back pulled out a phone, then thought better of it. I could feel the heat in my cheek under the vent. Ethan planted both hands on the table in front of him and spoke as if the rest of the evening had already been canceled. He wasn't about to make peace. 6 months ago, Ethan said, my company was 3 days from missing payroll. That sentence landed harder than I expected, maybe because until then most of the room still thought this was a family fight with money as an insult, not a fact. Ethan ran a freight analytics startup that had good software and terrible timing. A client delayed payment, a vendor dispute froze part of his line, and a bridge loan collapsed in 48 hours. I knew because I had sat on his apartment floor with spreadsheets between pizza boxes while he decided which employee he could afford to lose first. He kept going. "I didn't tell my parents how bad it was," he said. "I didn't tell most of you either. I told Lena." Vivian folded her arms. "And?" He looked straight ahead. "She covered the shortfall that same week as a short-term bridge. Quietly. No strings, no leverage. And I repaid her as soon as the delayed client payment cleared. She kept my company alive." A murmur rolled through the room. One of Ethan's friends actually whispered, "What?" under his breath. Ethan's father stared at him like he had just switched languages. I kept my face still because this had never been a story I wanted told at a party, least of all like this. But the room had already moved, and there was no calling it back. The room turned toward me. Vivian laughed. I will give her that. She recovered quickly when there was still a chance to control the interpretation. "Well, there it is," she said, lifting her glass a fraction. Thank you, Ethan. That actually explains everything. A couple of heads turned toward her again, grateful for a version they could understand. People don't hand over that kind of money without wanting something, she said. Influence isn't always loud. Sometimes it's dressed up as generosity. I watched Ethan's face go from anger to clarity. That was new. Normally, when his mother twisted something, he got caught in the old reflex of translating her into something less ugly. This time he just let the words sit there in the room in their true shape. "You think she bought me?" he asked. Vivian smiled at him, patient, almost sad. "I think powerful women know how to secure loyalty." "From your own son?" I said before I could stop myself. Vivian didn't look at me. "From whoever is useful," she replied. A few guests who had been nodding a moment earlier stopped. One woman near the cake table actually took a step back from Vivian, like proximity itself had become a statement. Ethan's father opened his mouth, then closed it, calculating. Even now, she refused to stop digging. Ethan finally turned to his mother. "No, Mother," he said, each word deliberate. "She didn't use my money. She used her own." Vivian blinked once, annoyed rather than confused, as if she thought he was being imprecise on purpose. "That doesn't even make sense," she said. Ethan stepped fully between us then, not touching me, just taking up space in a way he should have done much earlier in the evening. "It makes perfect sense," he said. "You just never asked the right questions." The room had gone so quiet I could hear the air conditioning hum. One of Vivian's friends looked openly embarrassed now. Another guest, a man from one of Ethan's incubator circles, frowned at me like he was trying to place a face he had seen on a panel or in a trade article. Vivian's mouth tightened. "Ethan, don't be ridiculous," she said. "If she had that kind of money, we'd know." He almost smiled at that, but there was no humor in it. "That," he said, "is exactly the problem." I watched his shoulders settle, as if some private argument inside him had finally ended. He had stopped trying to preserve everyone at once. That was the first time he put his body between us. The murmuring started in earnest after that. Guests leaned toward each other. Someone whispered my first name with a question mark at the end of it. Ethan's father stepped forward from the far side of the table, his color rising under that practiced country club calm. "What money of her own?" he demanded. "What are you talking about?" He wasn't asking from curiosity. He was asking like a man who had just discovered there was a meeting happening in the next room and his name wasn't on the invite. Ethan looked at me then, and only then. He didn't need permission exactly, but he was asking for it anyway. I understood that if I nodded, the rest of the party would not be ours anymore. It would become a story everyone else told later with great excitement and poor details. I also understood that if I shook my head, Vivian would leave that room believing she had struck me, named me, and won. So I nodded. Small. Once. Ethan exhaled through his nose and turned back to the room. Vivian saw the exchange and her expression changed for the first time into something less certain. She was realizing the secret she had mocked might be real. I could practically hear the evening splitting open. There was no putting it back. "Lena founded Rootspan," Ethan said. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "She built it before she met me. She still owns the controlling stake, and on Tuesday her company, through its investment arm Rootspan Strategic, closed the Harbor Mesh acquisition." For 2 full seconds, nobody moved. Then recognition started hopping around the room the way light jumps across glass. Ethan's father frowned first, then froze. A guest near the windows actually said, "Rootspan?" out loud. Vivian's face emptied in a way I had never seen. Rootspan was not flashy consumer tech. We built warehouse and freight visibility systems. We made companies less chaotic, which rarely made headlines outside the industries that needed it, and I kept a deliberately low public profile. I rarely gave interviews, and when I did, the coverage focused on the company, not on me. Outside the industry, people knew the company's name far more often than they knew my face, and Ethan had respected my wish to keep my title out of family conversations until that night. But the people in that room understood supply chains, commercial property, shipping volume, and who had just bought Harbor Mesh. They understood size. They understood leverage. I had spent the whole evening letting them treat me like I had wandered into the wrong room because I wanted Ethan to have one clean celebration before we dealt with the rest of his family. Now there would be no clean anything. Ethan reached for my hand, and I let him take it. Vivian looked from him to me and back again, as if one of us had switched places with an imposter while she was talking. Then the room changed. Recognition never arrives all at once. It moved in waves. First, one guest near the bar said, "No way," too softly to count as interruption. Then Darlene, who had laughed about my bus rides, put a hand to her chest and murmured, "Root span is hers?" Ethan's father pulled out his phone, stared at the screen for 3 seconds, and went still. Across the room, Peter Lang, the banker who had been advising Richard on the refinance for months, lowered his glass and looked at me with professional caution. I watched it happen on faces all over the room. Whatever they had assumed about me, mid-level, eager, grateful, lucky, fell apart in silence. Vivian went pale under her makeup, but instead of stopping, she reached for the nearest version of control. "So she hid it," she said sharply. "Of course she hid it. What is that if not manipulation?" Nobody answered her right away. They were too busy recalculating the value of the woman she had just hit. "You don't conceal that kind of thing unless you want power over people," she added, but her voice had lost its polish. She was no longer speaking as the authority in the room. She was speaking as someone who knew she had made a catastrophic mistake and could not quite bring herself to say the word mistake. Her tone had changed, but not her instinct. I stepped out from behind Ethan before anyone could answer for me. My cheek still stung, which helped. Pain can be clarifying. "I hid it because I wanted one thing in this family that wasn't a negotiation," I said. Vivian opened her mouth, but I kept going. "I wanted to be liked for being me, not for what I own, not for what I could fund, not because a spreadsheet somewhere made me useful." Nobody spoke. "You all heard about the bus rides tonight like they were a joke," I said. "I took the bus because I was building something. I wore the same black coat for 3 winters because I was paying engineers. I ate bad deli sandwiches at my desk because every dollar mattered. None of that embarrassed me then, and it doesn't embarrass me now." I looked directly at Vivian. What embarrassed me was standing here for months, letting you decide who I was because I wanted Ethan to have a chance to handle this privately. Ethan's mother had no answer to that wouldn't make her smaller, so she chose silence. A few guests looked away from me, not out of disdain now, but out of shame. I had not raised my voice once. I was done auditioning for basic respect. Ethan took over before the room slid into apology theater. "And while we're being honest," he said, "my parents have spent the last few months pressuring me for money." His father snapped his head up. "Watch yourself." Ethan did not. "They wanted me to increase my contribution to Holloway Holdings, the family office," he said. "They wanted introductions I told them I couldn't make. Even after they sent their materials through the normal intake process, they kept pushing me to move them to the front. They wanted me to stop saying no every time a new gap showed up." Vivian found her voice again. "That is not what happened." Ethan looked at her with a steadiness I had been waiting to see. You asked me 3 times in 1 week if I knew anyone who could backstop a restructure, he said. You told me family was supposed to show up. You implied I was being selfish for protecting my own company. He turned to the guests. They weren't worried about my future. They were worried about theirs. That sentence traveled through the room like cold air. I saw several people connect recent dinners, his father's warmth around business, and the vague questions about freight networks and strategic capital. They had not been making conversation. They had been fishing through Ethan. Vivian crossed her arms again, but now it looked less like confidence and more like she was holding herself together. Now their real problem was in the room. Enough, Ethan's father said. His voice cut harder than Vivian's ever did because he used it so sparingly. He stepped toward Ethan, every inch the man who was accustomed to being obeyed in boardrooms and at home. You will stop this right now. Ethan did not move. No, he said. You want me quiet because the bank already said no. Several heads lifted at that. His father's face changed in a flash of alarm before he locked it down again. Ethan kept going. Yesterday morning, your refinance was rejected without outside backing. That's why you've been calling me nonstop. That's why every recent dinner suddenly turned into strategy sessions. That's why Lena was treated like a threat the second Mom realized she couldn't place her. Vivian whispered his name like warning would still work. It didn't. Ethan looked at the guests, then back at his father. You're over-leveraged on the warehouses in Joliet and the Elmhurst property. The bank wants capital, not family pride. The room did something strange then. It didn't get louder. It got tighter. People who understood finance stopped pretending this was none of their business. Others knew enough to hear the word rejected and recognize blood. Ethan's father reached for the back of a chair as if he needed the balance more than the posture. The silence got expensive. Peter Lang cleared his throat, and because he was Peter, a man who had spent 20 years saying difficult things like they were calendar reminders, everyone actually listened. Richard, he said to Ethan's father, not unkindly. Rootspan Strategic is the group you've been trying to get in front of since January. No one answered him. Peter glanced at me, then back at Richard. The Harbor Mesh acquisition gave them a broader distribution footprint and more cash flexibility. If you were hoping for a logistics-linked investor with operational upside, that's the one. Your materials came through the normal intake process weeks ago. You just didn't know whose desk the final answer would land on. He didn't say the rest because he didn't need to. That's the one. And she's standing right here. Vivian looked at me as if she could somehow backspace the last 20 minutes by force of will. Richard said nothing at all. Ethan's hand brushed mine again, not to lead me, just to tell me he was still here. I looked around the room at the flowers his mother had chosen, the hotel staff waiting by the door, the people who had watched me be insulted in stages and had only really become uncomfortable when the market value changed. My face still hurt. My humiliation didn't. That part had burned off. By the time Peter finished his sentence, I already knew exactly what I would and would not do next. As far as his parents were concerned, my answer was already no. Vivian was the first to try to rewrite the story. She took 2 careful steps toward me, palms half lifted, the universal gesture of a woman asking for grace she would never have offered first. Lena, she said, and for the first time my name sounded soft in her mouth. This has clearly gotten out of hand. I almost laughed at the scale of that understatement. Emotions were high. People said things. I think, for everyone's sake, it would be best to put this unfortunate misunderstanding behind us. She did not say, I'm sorry. Not once. Richard moved in beside her, recovering faster now that he saw a path back to the subject he cared about. "We should sit down privately," he said. "There's no need to make permanent decisions in a heated moment." Ethan made a sound under his breath, something between disbelief and disgust. Vivian ignored him. "You and Ethan are family," she said to me. "Surely we can start again." She meant erase the slap, erase the insult, erase what this room heard, and proceed to the useful part. Around us, guests pretended not to watch, which is how adults watch hardest. I looked at Vivian's face and finally understood that wealth had hidden her from consequences for so long she mistook access for forgiveness. Now she wanted softness from me. I took my phone from the small bag on the table and opened the message thread with my chief of staff, Marisol. My hands were steady. "I can forgive ignorance," I said, typing as I spoke. "I don't forgive cruelty." Vivian's expression tightened. Richard started to say my name, but I lifted one finger and finished the text. "Please pull Holloway Holdings from Monday's internal review queue. No meeting, no follow-up, no exception." Then I hit send. "And I will not tie my company to people who publicly humiliate others," I said. "Not as investors, not as partners, not through Ethan, not any other way." Marisol's reply came back almost immediately. "Done." Richard saw the screen light in my hand and lost the careful tone. "Lena, that would be extremely short-sighted," he said. There was the second front. Money, access, urgency. Vivian tried more. "No one is asking for special treatment. You built an entire evening on the idea that I was beneath your standards," I said. "You don't get to pivot to strategy because the numbers changed." Ethan stepped beside me and let the line hold. That mattered more than any speech. Richard's face hardened into something flat and practical. He understood closed doors better than hurt feelings. I slid my phone back into my bag. I sent the text before anyone could bargain. Then Ethan turned away from his parents and fully toward me. He stepped back just enough to face me properly, and in the quiet, dropped to one knee on the carpet Vivian had chosen for her perfect party. A few people gasped again, but for a reason I could live with. Ethan looked up at me, not smiling, not performing, just clear. "Lena," he said, "I asked you to marry me because I love you. That hasn't changed tonight, but I need to say the rest out loud in front of everyone who watched this happen." His mother made a small sound, and he ignored it. "I should have shut this down sooner. I should have protected you before it got here. I won't make that mistake again." His voice stayed steady. "So I'm asking you something bigger than an engagement party and bigger than them. Will you still marry me and build a life with me where nobody gets to disrespect you just because they share my last name?" It was not flashy. It was better. It was a public boundary from a man finally done splitting himself in half for his parents. I could see that his hands were shaking a little. He was terrified I would say no, and maybe he had earned that fear. This time, he chose in public. "Yes," I said. My voice came out calm enough to surprise the room. Then, because his face changed so completely when I said it, I added, "But not if you ever ask me to swallow something like this again." Ethan nodded once. "Never again," he said. Only then did the room break. A few guests clapped first out of relief, then with actual force. Ethan stood and put both hands around my face, carefully avoiding the side his mother had hit. Richard looked like someone had closed a deal without him. Vivian had no expression at all now, just absence. One of the hotel servers appeared beside us with ice wrapped in a napkin, and I thanked her like we were the only two people in the room with proper manners left. Richard took one step forward, maybe to restart the business conversation, maybe to salvage his authority. Ethan turned before he could speak. "We're leaving," he said. Not loud. Final. Vivian said his name, and he didn't stop. He took my bag, I took his hand, and together we walked past the cake, past the flowers, past 27 witnesses who would never again be able to pretend they hadn't seen what kind of people his parents were when they thought I had nothing to offer. We walked out together. We got married 4 months later in a smaller room with better light and far fewer opinions. Not a hotel ballroom, not a spectacle, just a lakeside garden in early June with close friends. My sister, Ethan's cousin who had quietly texted me an apology the week after the party, and a short guest list we wrote ourselves. Vivian and Richard came because Ethan wanted the door open if they could behave inside it. This time they arrived early, sat where they were placed, and spoke to me with the careful manners of people who had finally learned there were consequences for contempt. They were also, very suddenly, humble. Rootspan did not take their meeting. Rootspan did not make an exception. They eventually sold one property, restructured the rest, and discovered that silence is much cheaper than arrogance when banks stop being sentimental. Ethan separated his business from theirs completely and stopped translating their demands into obligations. At home, our rules are simple now. Respect is not negotiable, apologies have to sound like apologies, and family does not mean permanent access to our peace. Vivian has never tried anything like that again. Richard asks before bringing up work. And the woman they called a gold digger? She turned out to be the one person in that room who never needed their money at all.
Hi, some of you have been asking me to start narrating my own stories, which I'm doing now, but on a different channel. So if that's something for you, then check it out.